For 10 years, they fed a little girl poison. Not the kind of poison that kills you in an instant, but the kind that steals the world away, drop by agonizing drop. They told her it was medicine. They told her billionaire father it was her only hope. But it was a lie. A lie so dark it kept an heiress locked in a silent black prison, all for a secret she was never meant to discover. For a decade, everyone who walked the marble halls of the Sterling estate believed the story. Serafina Sterling, the sole heir to a tech empire, was born into a world of absolute darkness, completely and irreversibly blind. No one questioned it. Not the world-renowned specialists, not the loyal staff who moved like ghosts through the mansion, not even her own father, a man who could bend markets to his will, but couldn't see the truth right in front of him. She lived in a soundless, sightless void, a beautiful doll hidden away in a gilded cage filled with whispered secrets. But everything was about to shatter. The change didn't come from a miracle cure or a brilliant doctor. It came in the form of a new maid, a woman with nothing to her name but a broken heart and eyes that saw what everyone else had been trained to ignore. What she would uncover during her quiet, thankless work would unravel a decade of deceit, challenge a powerful family's tragic past, and drag a horrifying truth into the light. A truth buried since the day the little girl was born. What started as a job to pay the bills would become a mission, and what she found would detonate a bomb in the heart of a man who thought he had done everything to protect his only child. Before we dive deep into this web of deceit, do me a huge favor and smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a single twist. And hey, drop a comment down below and tell me where you're tuning in from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Alistair Sterling was a titan in the world of artificial intelligence, a man whose name was synonymous with innovation and ruthless efficiency. He had built a fortune from code and algorithms, creating a digital empire with the sheer force of his intellect. But behind the firewall of his public persona, the man was a ghost, haunting the sprawling, desolate estate he called home. Perched on a cliff overlooking the stormy Pacific coast of Northern California, the mansion was a monument to modern architecture, all glass, steel, and cold, empty spaces. It was a fortress designed to keep the world out, but it had also become a prison for the two souls rattling around inside, Alistair and his 10-year-old daughter, Serafina. The house echoed with a silence that was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of loss. 10 years ago, just 3 days after Serafina's birth, Alistair's wife, Elena, had been killed when their private jet went down in a storm. The tragedy didn't just break his heart, it shattered his very foundation. He retreated from the world, not seeking peace, but fleeing the pity and the questions in everyone's eyes. His universe shrank until it contained only one person, Serafina. She was the last piece of Elena he had left, the living, breathing purpose that kept him from completely disintegrating. But Serafina's condition was a constant, grinding torment. From birth, the doctors had delivered a devastating verdict. She was blind. A rare congenital condition, they'd said. No hope for recovery. Alistair, a man who solved impossible problems for a living, blamed himself. He ran through 1,000 what-ifs. Had it been something in his genes? Something they were exposed to? His days became a monotonous loop of quiet routines, suffocating sadness, and a constant, gnawing anxiety about her future. The mansion was filled with every luxury imaginable, every cutting-edge assistive technology designed to help the visually impaired, but Serafina seemed to exist in a world beyond their reach. Alistair had flown in specialists from Zurich, Tokyo, and London. He'd hired an army of therapists, tutors, and alternative healers, each one promising a breakthrough, a flicker of connection. Nothing worked. Serafina rarely spoke. She never played with the expensive toys that gathered dust in her room. She never laughed. Most of her days were spent in a large armchair by the floor-to-ceiling windows in the living room. Her face turned toward the glass, as if she could feel the sea spray and hear the distant cry of gulls. Her eyes, a startling shade of violet just like her mother's, were always vacant, staring into a space no one else could see. It was as if she were a beautiful ship moored in a harbor, with no sails to catch the wind. Alistair would often sit in the opposite corner of the cavernous room, watching her for hours, a profound sense of helplessness crushing him. He read her classic novels, his voice a low monotone filling the silence. He told her stories of her mother, of their travels, of the vibrant colors of a Marrakech market. He played classical music on the grand piano, the notes echoing through the empty halls. Her reactions were maddeningly subtle, a slight tilt of the head, a faint furrowing of her brow. These tiny gestures were the scraps he clung to, desperate to believe they were signs of a mind at work, a soul listening. He constantly wondered if she even knew who he was, if his presence registered as anything more than a familiar sound, a familiar scent. At 45, Alistair looked a decade older. Grief had carved deep lines into his face. His once dark hair was shot through with silver, and his eyes, the same sharp gray as a stormy sea, were perpetually tired. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He had severed ties with friends, delegated the majority of his company's operations, and canceled all public appearances. He couldn't bear to be away from Serafina for more than a few hours. His routine was rigid, a defense against the chaos of his emotions. He would dress Serafina himself, carefully selecting soft fabrics he thought she might like. He'd prepare her breakfast, describing the tastes and textures of the food. He'd guide her by the hand on slow walks through the manicured gardens, describing the scent of the salt on the wind and the feel of a rose petal. There were moments, late at night, when the dam of his control would break. Fits of rage would wash over him, rage at fate, at the doctors, at God, at himself. He would often stand over Serafina's bed while she slept and whisper apologies into the darkness, as if she could hear the crushing guilt in his heart. For all his billions, for all his genius, he couldn't fix the one thing that mattered. He couldn't heal his daughter's silent pain. The staff at the Sterling estate was a small, discreet team who had been with the family for years. They tiptoed around the house, speaking in hushed tones, respecting Alistair's self-imposed isolation. They had watched Serafina grow from a silent baby into a silent girl, and they spoke of her with a sad reverence. They'd share little observations among themselves, the way she would sometimes hum a soft, aimless tune at night, or how she always reached for the same worn-out stuffed rabbit before sleeping. But to Alistair, these were just flickers in an endless night. He craved more. He wanted a sign, a word, a smile that showed she was truly there, inside her own mind. Sometimes he'd sit beside her for an entire afternoon, just talking, telling her about a new AI breakthrough, about memories of Elena, about the ships he could see on the horizon. He hoped one word, one phrase, would be the key to unlock her. But Serafina remained a beautiful, inscrutable mystery, occasionally nodding or turning her head, leaving him to wonder what it all meant. The mansion itself had become a mausoleum. It was built for a family, for laughter and life, but it held only two lonely people. Every room was a shrine to a hope that had died. The nursery remained untouched, exactly as Elena had designed it. Walls painted with soft clouds and whimsical animals, a rocking chair still waiting by the crib. Alistair hadn't moved a single object since the crash. Sometimes he would just stand in the doorway, drowning in memories he couldn't let go of. Serafina had never shown any interest in the room. She didn't explore, didn't ask questions. Alistair had resigned himself to this strange, muted existence. But somewhere, buried deep beneath the layers of grief and despair, a tiny ember of hope still glowed. He read every new medical study on childhood neurology. He secretly consulted with new doctors. He tried every new therapy he could find. Each attempt was just another closed door. Yet he refused to bolt it shut. And so, the days bled into one another, slow, heavy, and silent. Alistair remained a devoted warden to his silent daughter, a man who rarely slept and never found peace. He guided her hand at the dinner table, held her as they walked the windy cliffs, and whispered bedtime stories with a voice thick with a love that was almost indistinguishable from pain. And Serafina remained quiet, her face a placid mask, her violet eyes always gazing at nothing. But every now and then, she would lean her head against his chest for a few fleeting seconds. And those moments were the only thing that gave him the strength to face another dawn. In that lonely palace of glass and shadows, Alistair Sterling lived for the silent girl who never asked for anything. His daughter, who sat by the window with the same empty gaze. Clara Maeve was 30 years old, and she was adrift in the wreckage of her life. Just 6 months earlier, she had lost her newborn daughter, Lily, to a sudden, inexplicable illness. The days that followed were a blur of sterile hospital rooms, hollow condolences, and a silence in her small apartment that was louder than any scream. Clara lived on the frayed edges of town, in a place where dreams went to die. She had no partner, no family to lean on, and was working 2 dead-end jobs just to keep her head above water. She saw the advertisement for a housekeeping position at the Sterling estate in a crumpled newspaper while waiting for a bus in the rain. She applied without a second thought. Part of her was desperate for the money, but a bigger part was desperate to be anywhere else, far from the 4 walls of her apartment that held the ghost of a lullaby. The estate was imposing, hidden behind massive iron gates and a long, winding driveway that snaked through a forest of cypress trees. When Clara arrived for the interview, she felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach, but she pushed it down. She wasn't dressed to impress, just in clean, simple clothes. Alistair Sterling opened the colossal front door himself, which caught her off guard. He looked exactly like his photos in business magazines, but older, more haggard. His eyes were serious and observant, but there was a deep-seated sadness in them that she recognized immediately. Alistair had interviewed a dozen candidates before Clara. They all had pristine resumes and glowing references, but something about each of them felt wrong. They were either too talkative, too clinical, or visibly uncomfortable around the heavy silence of the house and the specter of his daughter. When Clara walked in, he noticed her quiet composure. She didn't try to fill the silence with nervous chatter. Her eyes, a warm, gentle brown, scanned the room respectfully, not with a tourist's curiosity, but with a quiet solemnity. During the interview, he asked her the standard questions, and she answered clearly and concisely. There was a directness about her, but it was softened by a palpable gentleness. At one point, she hesitated, then said, "I should tell you, I recently lost a child." She didn't offer details, and a flicker of something, empathy, understanding, crossed Alistair's face. He nodded, not pressing further, but that single brave sentence shifted the dynamic. He saw in her face a reflection of his own pain, but also a resilience he had long since lost. She wasn't hiding her scars. Clara's first day began at dawn. A senior staff member gave her a brisk tour of the mansion, outlining the rigorous cleaning schedule. Alistair was polite but distant. The house was an intimidating labyrinth of unused rooms and gleaming surfaces. Clara lost herself in the work, moving methodically from one space to the next, a silent phantom in a house full of them. Around noon, she was permitted a short break in the cavernous staff kitchen, and that's when she first saw her. Serafina was sitting on the floor in the adjacent sunroom, near a window, clutching a small, threadbare stuffed rabbit. Her head was tilted slightly, her expression distant, almost blank. Clara stopped in the doorway, watching for a moment. She had never seen a child so perfectly still, so contained. There was something about the girl that resonated deep within the hollow space in Clara's chest. It wasn't just pity for her blindness. It was the profound loneliness that radiated from her small frame. Clara didn't say a word. She just sat down quietly on a stool across the room and ate her sandwich. Even without an exchange, she felt it. This child was different. It wasn't just blindness. It was isolation. In the following days, Clara settled into her routine. She was meticulous in her work, never prying, never asking unnecessary questions. She cleaned, she organized, she followed her instructions to the letter. But all the while, she was observing. She started to notice tiny details about Serafina that the others seemed to miss. The girl rarely reacted to voices or loud noises, but she would sometimes pause, her head turning almost imperceptibly, when Clara entered a room with her soft-soled shoes. Once, while dusting a high shelf, Clara dropped a feather duster. The soft whoosh and gentle thump on the carpet made Serafina flinch, a tiny, almost invisible tremor. Clara whispered an apology, even though she knew the girl couldn't see her. Over time, Clara realized that Serafina responded most to calm, steady rhythms and soft sounds. She also saw how the other staff members kept a respectful, almost fearful distance from the child, careful not to disturb her fragile peace. Clara, however, felt an inexplicable pull toward the girl. She didn't see a broken thing to be fixed. She saw a child who needed more than just care. She needed a connection, and Clara, still crushed by the weight of her own loss, felt the first stirrings of a new purpose taking root in her heart. One afternoon, while Clara was folding fresh linens in the upstairs hallway near Serafina's room, she heard it. A small, faint sound, a quiet, melodic hum. Curious, she stopped and listened intently. It was Serafina. She was sitting on the floor just inside her doorway, humming a tune that seemed to have no beginning or end. Clara didn't interrupt. She simply sat on the floor nearby, continuing her task. After several minutes, the humming stopped. Then, Serafina slowly began to crawl out into the hallway, her small hands sweeping the air in front of her, searching for the wall. Without thinking, Clara stood up and silently offered her hand. Serafina's searching hand froze mid-air, hovering near Clara's. Then, with a delicate, cautious movement, she touched her fingertips to Clara's. The contact was brief, electric. Clara didn't speak, didn't breathe. In that silent touch, a message was passed. It felt like trust, or at the very least, a flicker of curiosity. From that day on, Clara made a point of working near Serafina more often, not to intrude, but simply to be a quiet, steady presence. Alistair noticed. Though Clara never said a word about it, he saw a subtle shift in his daughter. She no longer spent all her time cemented to the chair by the window. Sometimes she would sit in the hallway or near the kitchen, in the same general area where Clara was working. One evening, Alistair stopped Clara as she was leaving. "How are things going?" he asked, his voice low. She answered honestly. "She reminds me of someone I lost," Clara said, her voice soft. "But I don't want to replace anyone. I just want to help." Alistair didn't reply immediately. He studied her face for a long moment, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. He was not a man who trusted easily, But he saw no guile in Clara. There was no pity in her actions, only quiet attention and a genuine, unvarnished care. That night, after Clara had retired to her small room, Alistair stood outside Serafina's door. He watched his daughter sleep, and for the first time in a long time, he noticed her breathing seemed deeper, calmer. Clara's arrival hadn't magically fixed anything, but a stone had been dropped into the still, stagnant pool of their lives, and the ripples were just beginning to spread. Clara was quietly dusting the bookshelves in Serafina's room, moving with the practiced grace of someone trying to be invisible. She always made a point not to disturb the girl, especially when Serafina was in her usual corner, clutching the same worn-out stuffed rabbit. Clara had learned that the girl seemed to prefer the predictable hum of the house to any direct interaction. But on this particular day, as she reached to wipe down a low wooden chest, she froze. She heard a soft sound, a murmur, almost too faint to be real. At first, she dismissed it as the wind. She turned slightly to look at Serafina. The little girl was rocking gently, hugging the rabbit tightly to her chest, her lips moving. She was whispering something. Clara leaned in, just a fraction, straining to listen. Serafina's voice was a slow, fragile thread of sound, but it was there. She wasn't just making noises. She was forming words, though they were too jumbled to understand. Clara held her breath, not wanting to break the spell. Her gaze fixed on Serafina's face, and something in the girl's expression sent a jolt through her. It was emotion. Subtle, but undeniable. This was not the blank, disconnected child everyone described. There was a whole world churning just beneath that placid surface. Clara slowly backed away and sank into a small armchair near the dresser. From this vantage point, she could observe without being intrusive. As Serafina continued to whisper to her rabbit, Clara noticed something else. Something she'd seen before but hadn't truly processed. The girl's head moved with microscopic precision in response to every sound. The creak of a floorboard upstairs, the rustle of a curtain in the breeze, the distant whine of the gardener's leaf blower. Serafina reacted to it all with the subtle, precise movements of a radar dish. Her hearing was so acutely tuned, it seemed she could map the entire mansion just by listening. Clara watched in fascinated silence, her mind racing. The girl's reactions felt too sharp, too oriented for someone who had only ever known darkness. Slowly, Clara rose and walked across the thick Persian rug. Before she was halfway across the room, Serafina's head had already turned in her direction. The girl didn't speak, but she had tracked the movement perfectly. Clara placed a small wooden block on the floor and nudged it with her toe. Serafina's body shifted again, orienting toward the exact source of the sound. A wild idea began to form in Clara's mind. She began a series of gentle tests. She quietly opened a drawer, then slid it shut. She took a soft step, then a harder one. Each time, Serafina reacted. It was always small, a twitch of an ear, a tilt of her chin, but it was always flawlessly accurate. Clara wondered if it was just her hearing, or if something else was at play. She gathered a few of Serafina's toys. Some made noise, others were purely textural. But one, a simple plastic star, had a button that made it flash with colored lights. She turned it on, aiming it at the wall. Serafina didn't respond. Of course, Clara thought, she's blind. But then, as Clara pulled out her phone to check the time, her thumb accidentally activated the flashlight. The bright beam cut across the room, sweeping in front of Serafina's face for a fraction of a second. In that instant, Clara saw it. A flicker. Serafina's eyelids twitched. Her pupils, the dark centers of her violet eyes, seemed to contract slightly. It was so fast, so faint, She almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She stood frozen, watching, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes had just seen. She switched the flashlight off and waited a full minute, her own breathing seeming deafeningly loud in the quiet room. Then she turned it on again, this time intentionally waving the phone from side to side in a slow arc in front of Serafina's face. The girl's head remained still, but her eyes flickered again, a subtle, jerky movement, as if they were trying to track something they couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't a strong, focused gaze, but it was a reaction, a definite reaction to the light. Clara took a tentative step closer and repeated the motion. Serafina's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes moved again, following the path of the light for a split second before returning to their vacant stare. Clara stumbled back and sat down heavily on the armchair, a wave of confusion and shock washing over her. Was it possible? Could Serafina see something? Even just a glimmer of light? Clara wasn't a doctor, but this was not the response of a person who was completely blind. It made no sense. The diagnosis had been absolute. She forced herself to think logically. Maybe it was an involuntary reflex, a trick of the light. But she had spent weeks around Serafina, studying her every micro-expression. She knew the difference between a random twitch and a direct response. And this felt real. A sudden, icy chill snaked down her spine. She looked at Serafina, who was now sitting quietly again, her fingers tracing the worn seams of the rabbit's ear. The girl seemed utterly oblivious to the monumental event that had just occurred. Clara was torn. What should she do? Run to Alistair and risk giving him a devastating false hope? Or wait, test again, be absolutely certain? 1,000 possibilities, 1,000 fears swirled in her head. She couldn't ignore what she had seen. It wasn't just a feeling. It was a physical reaction, something that defied a decade of medical certainty. Okay, I have to pause here because my mind is blown. What would you do in Clara's shoes? Would you confront the billionaire father right away? Or would you try to gather more undeniable evidence first? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments. And if you're getting chills right now, make sure you've hit that like button to let me know you're with me on this journey. Clara switched off the flashlight and shoved the phone deep into her pocket. She sat in silence, just watching Serafina for several more minutes. The little girl began her soft whispering again, hugging her rabbit close. Clara stayed there, feeling a strange, potent cocktail of fear, curiosity, and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Hope. For the first time, it felt like a different future might be possible, a future no one had dared to imagine. As the room fell quiet, Clara finished her dusting, her mind still reeling. Before leaving the room, she took one last look at Serafina. Something had irrevocably changed in that room today. Whether it was a reaction to light, a neurological fluke, or something more, it was enough. It was a spark. Clara gently closed the door behind her and walked down the long, silent hallway, her mind already planning her next steps. Perhaps she would try again tomorrow, with a different light source. Perhaps she would find a way to talk to Alistair without sounding insane. But for now, the secret was hers. Back in her room, Serafina sat still, whispering words only she and her rabbit could hear, while in the hallway, Clara held on to the memory of a flicker of light that had the power to change everything. Clara couldn't shake the image from her mind. Serafina's eyes had moved. She had replayed the moment 100 times, and she was certain. It wasn't a fluke. It didn't align with anything she had been told about the girl's absolute, congenital blindness. That was the story Alistair believed. the story the doctors had written. But Clara had witnessed a different story, and now she had to find the truth. The next morning, after her usual chores, she returned to Serafina's room. The girl was on her soft rug near the window, a familiar silhouette against the gray morning light. Clara moved about the room casually, folding a blanket, tidying shelves, maintaining the rhythm of any other day. Then, without a sound, she slowly pushed open the large casement window a few inches wider than usual. A shaft of brighter sunlight sliced into the room. It wasn't a sound or a touch. It was a change in the ambient light. Serafina, who had been facing away, turned her head slightly in that direction. Not a sharp turn, but a definite, subtle orientation toward the brightness. Clara held her breath. This was another piece of the puzzle. Later that day, Clara devised another small experiment. She found Serafina sitting calmly in the hallway, clutching her rabbit. Clara took out her phone again, turning on the flashlight while pretending to inspect a scuff mark on the baseboard near a cabinet. Then, she slowly moved her hand back and forth between the beam of light and Serafina's face, creating a slow, rhythmic pattern of light and shadow. She did it several times, careful not to make a sound or any sudden movements. For a few seconds, Serafina didn't react. But then, one of her eyes tracked a passing shadow. It was a tiny, reflexive movement. Clara repeated it, slower this time. Again. The girl's gaze shifted, just barely, but it shifted. Clara's heart began to hammer against her ribs. This was no longer a coincidence. There was a demonstrable link between the light and her eyes. It wasn't clear, focused vision, but it wasn't blindness either. That evening, Clara sat in her room and wrote everything down, documenting each test and reaction in a small notebook. The next few days were a quiet frenzy of observation. Clara told no one what she was doing. She didn't want to alarm Alistair or be accused of overstepping her bounds. But the conviction in her gut grew stronger with each passing day. She continued her discrete tests, slow flashes of light, quick movements in Serafina's peripheral field, sudden changes in brightness from a lamp. And Serafina kept reacting. The responses weren't always consistent, but they kept happening. That was enough. One afternoon, while cleaning the vast master bathroom, Clara noticed a small, locked wooden box tucked away on a high shelf in the linen closet, hidden behind a stack of towels. Her curiosity piqued. She found the small key in a dish on the vanity. Inside the box were several small bottles of eye drops. The labels were old and peeling, but she could make out the name of a doctor, Dr. Adrian Croft. Each bottle was dated, going back 10 years. There were no clear instructions, no diagnosis listed on the labels, only a dosage. 2 drops, each eye, daily. They had clearly been a part of Serafina's life for a very long time. Clara examined one of the bottles. It didn't look like a standard saline or allergy drop. The liquid was slightly viscous. There were complex chemical names she didn't recognize. Later, when she was sure no one was around, she looked up the primary active ingredient on her phone. What she found made her stomach clench. The compound was a potent cycloplegic agent, used in ophthalmology to temporarily paralyze the focusing muscles of the eye and dilate the pupils, usually for examinations. In high, prolonged doses, especially in a developing child, medical articles and forums warned it could severely inhibit the eye's natural response to light and could, in some rare cases, mimic the symptoms of blindness. There was no clear medical reason why a child born blind would be on such an aggressive, long-term regimen. A terrible thought began to form in Clara's mind. Could the drops have been suppressing what little vision Serafina had all along? Was this a catastrophic medical error, or something far, far worse? Clara couldn't be sure yet, but she knew one thing. This wasn't normal. She carefully placed the bottles back in the box, locked it, and put it exactly where she had found it. But now her concern had morphed into a terrifying suspicion. That night, sleep offered no escape. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind a whirlwind of questions. She didn't want to make baseless accusations. Maybe there was a legitimate, complex medical reason for the eye drops. But if Serafina could perceive light and shadow, even faintly, then Alistair deserved to know. He was a protective, grieving father who had placed his absolute trust in the medical establishment. Approaching him with a half-formed conspiracy theory could shatter him. Yet, keeping this secret felt like a betrayal of the silent, trusting girl in the next room. Serafina deserved a real chance. Clara felt a profound sense of responsibility for her, a connection that went far beyond her duties as a maid. She decided to continue her observations for a few more days, documenting everything with meticulous detail. Then she would have to find a way to tell him. But in her heart, she already knew. Something had been missed. Something had been hidden. Serafina's reactions weren't random. They were clues, and Clara had to follow them, no matter how dark the path became. Clara waited long enough. After a week of silent tests, detailed notes, and watching Serafina react to light and shadow, she felt she was ready. The quiet doubt had grown into a roaring conviction. She had to know for sure. She waited for the perfect moment, late in the evening when the house was still. The other staff had retired, and Alistair was sequestered in his office. Clara found Serafina on the rug in her room, gently rocking her stuffed rabbit. The girl seemed calm, her usual distant expression on her face. Clara knelt across from her, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She pulled the small flashlight from her pocket. "Serafina," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm going to shine a little light. Can you tell me if you feel anything?" Serafina didn't respond, but she didn't pull away. Slowly, with a trembling hand, Clara raised the flashlight and aimed the beam directly into Serafina's eyes. For a few agonizing seconds, nothing. Serafina's violet eyes remained wide, unblinking, and a wave of despair washed over Clara. Maybe she had been wrong all along. But then it happened. Serafina blinked, a slow, languid blink, as if she were confused. Then she blinked again, faster this time, a clear reaction to the brightness. Clara's breath hitched in her throat. She held the light steady, leaning forward. "Serafina, can you feel that?" she whispered. The silence in the room was absolute. Serafina tilted her head, her brows knitting together in concentration. Then, in a small, fragile voice she hadn't used in years, she uttered 5 words that shattered the world. "I think I saw a star. Mommy." The words were hesitant, broken, as if she were pulling them from a place long forgotten. Clara froze, the flashlight clattering to the floor. It wasn't just the possibility of sight. It was the name. Mommy. A word Serafina had never spoken, a ghost she had never known. Tears instantly welled in Clara's eyes. That single word cracked open the dam of her own grief. All the pain she had carried since losing Lily came rushing back, but this time it was mixed with a powerful, overwhelming sense of purpose. Serafina had reached out, not just with her senses, but with her heart. This was no longer a test. It was a connection. Clara didn't know if the girl had somehow confused her with the mother she'd never met, or if the word had simply bubbled up from her subconscious. But it didn't matter. She scrambled forward and gently placed a hand on Serafina's shoulder. "I'm here," she choked out, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe." Serafina didn't flinch. She leaned forward slowly, tentatively, until her head rested against Clara's chest. It was a small, simple gesture, but it was everything. It was trust. It was a beginning. Clara held the small, trembling girl, her mind racing. What did this mean? How much could she see? And what in God's name were those eye drops doing to her? She didn't have the answers, but she had something more important. A resolve forged in fire. From this moment on, her purpose in this house was not just to clean, it was to protect this child. When Serafina finally pulled back, her face seemed calmer, more present. Clara wiped her own tears and managed a watery smile. "You are so brave," she whispered. Serafina said nothing more, but the vacancy in her eyes seemed less profound. Clara knew this discovery would be difficult to explain to Alistair. But she also knew there was no going back. She had come to this house seeking an escape from her grief, and instead she had found a reason to fight. Serafina wasn't just a child with a medical condition, she was a prisoner, and Clara had just found the key. The next evening, Clara was kneeling in Serafina's room again, holding the flashlight. She had to be sure. She aimed the light, and just as before, Serafina blinked and turned her head toward the brightness. But before Clara could react, a voice boomed from the doorway. "What in God's name are you doing?" It was Alistair. He stormed into the room, his face a mask of thunderous rage and disbelief. "What is that in your hand?" he yelled, his voice echoing in the large room. Clara scrambled to her feet, trying to explain, but he snatched the flashlight from her. "Are you performing experiments on my daughter?" he roared, his eyes blazing. But before Clara could utter a word, something impossible happened. Serafina, the girl who never moved with purpose, stood up on shaky legs and ran. She ran straight to Clara, wrapping her small arms around her waist and clinging to her tightly, her body racked with tremors. Alistair was thunderstruck. He stared, speechless. He had never seen his daughter initiate contact, never seen her move with such intention. "Serafina?" he breathed, his anger instantly evaporating, replaced by utter confusion. The girl stayed buried in Clara's side for a moment. Then, with a small, shaking voice, she said the words that changed the world. "I saw the light." Alistair blinked. What did you say?" he stammered. Serafina turned her head toward the sound of his voice, and repeated louder this time. "I saw the light." Clara remained silent, letting the moment hang in the air. Alistair looked from his daughter clinging to the maid, to the flashlight on the floor, his entire world tilting on its axis. A decade of certainty had just been demolished by 4 simple words. Slowly his gaze met Clara's. He didn't understand, but he saw the truth in her eyes. In a low, hoarse voice, he gave his first command in a new reality. "Stop the eye drops, now." The days that followed were a quiet revolution. As per Alistair's order, the daily ritual of the eye drops ceased. The first day, nothing much changed. But by the second, a visible shift had begun. Serafina started turning her head toward the windows more often, not just as a habit, but as if she were drawn to the sunlight. Clara started leaving the curtains open all day, and Serafina would sit for long stretches, her face bathed in the light. Alistair watched from the doorway, a silent, stunned spectator to the miracle unfolding in his own home. Later that week, Clara sat with Serafina with large, high-contrast flashcards, a black circle, a square, a triangle. At first, Serafina showed no reaction, but then, after a long, silent moment, she slowly lifted a hand and pointed a small finger directly at the circle. A quiet gasp escaped Clara's lips. Alistair, who had been watching from across the room, stepped closer, his voice a disbelieving whisper. She saw that. Each day brought a new breakthrough. The progress was painstaking, but it was real. Clara worked with Serafina patiently, using simple visual games. One afternoon, she placed 3 brightly colored toys in front of her. Without a word, she nudged the yellow duck. A slow, wondrous smile spread across Serafina's face for the first time. Then, she pointed right at it. Alistair was nearby, and he simply sank into a chair, his eyes filled with a decade's worth of unshed tears. "She's choosing," he said quietly. That night, Serafina sat by the window and began asking questions. "What color?" she asked, pointing a finger toward a blue blanket. It shocked them both. Clara answered softly, and a dam seemed to break. Serafina began pointing at everything, asking the same simple question. Alistair stood in the doorway, a man witnessing the dawn after a lifetime of night. He was beginning to believe. One morning, Serafina walked toward a sunbeam slanting across the hallway floor. She didn't stumble. She moved with a new confidence, reaching her hand out to touch the light. "I don't understand how we missed this," Alistair said, his voice raw, but it no longer mattered how. All that mattered was what came next. Her smiles grew more frequent. She started looking at faces, her eyes trying to piece together the features. By the end of the week, the oppressive silence of the mansion had been replaced by the soft sounds of discovery. Laughter, questions, the scribble of crayons on paper. It all began the day she said, "I saw the light." Alistair and Clara now had a mission. One evening, after Serafina was asleep, Clara retrieved one of the bottles of eye drops. The next day, Alistair used his connections to get the sample to a private toxicology lab for an immediate, confidential analysis. The results came back in 48 hours. Alistair read the report, his face growing paler with every line. Clara watched as his hands began to shake, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the paper. "It's a chemical called cyclopentylate," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "In this concentration, the report says it's designed to induce prolonged pupillary paralysis. It mimics blindness." Clara felt sick. "So the drops, they were the cause?" Alistair nodded, his eyes dark with a terrifying fury. "They weren't treating a condition. They were creating one." He looked at the original prescription label again. Dr. Adrian Croft. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Alistair's fury was cold and methodical. He hired a team of private investigators. They discovered that Dr. Croft's medical license had been suspended years ago after a series of malpractice lawsuits, all quietly settled out of court. The cases all involved children with vision problems and questionable prescriptions. The man had vanished. As they dug deeper, a more sinister picture emerged. The investigators found encrypted financial records linking Dr. Croft to a shadowy pharmaceutical subsidiary. He hadn't just been a negligent doctor. He had been conducting unauthorized, illegal trials on his young patients, using them as human guinea pigs for an experimental compound, with Serafina as his longest-running subject. He had chosen the daughter of a reclusive, grieving billionaire, a father too broken to ask the right questions. When Alistair and his lawyers decided to go public, the blowback was immediate and vicious. Anonymous articles appeared online, painting Alistair as a negligent father who had isolated his child. Clara received threatening text messages. Some secrets are better left buried. But it was too late. The truth was out. Amidst the media storm, something beautiful was happening inside the mansion. Serafina was blossoming. A new team of specialists confirmed she had partial, functional vision. With therapy, she could learn to process the world around her. Julia and Alistair filled her days with color and light. One afternoon, Clara gave her a box of crayons. Serafina touched each one and then picked up the yellow. Her first drawing was a shaky, uneven line, but it was a beginning. She held it up proudly. "Is it good?" she asked. Alistair knelt beside her, his voice thick with emotion. It's a masterpiece. The drawing became the first of many. She drew the sun, the sea, Clara's smiling face. The walls of the mansion, once bare and cold, were now covered in her vibrant, joyful art. Her progress became their shield against the ugliness outside. They had found their purpose. The legal battle was grueling, but the evidence was irrefutable. Dr. Croft was eventually located living under an assumed name and arrested. His trial became a national sensation. Other families, emboldened by Alistair's fight, came forward. The pharmaceutical company was exposed, its executives charged. Julia testified, her voice clear and steady, telling the world how a flicker of light had unraveled a decade of darkness. When the guilty verdict was read, a quiet sense of justice settled over them. It wasn't a celebration. It was the closing of a painful chapter. Years passed. The mansion was no longer a place of sorrow, but a home filled with life and art. Serafina, with the unwavering support of Clara and Alistair, thrived. She enrolled in school, made friends, and discovered a profound passion for painting. Her art became her voice, a way to translate the world she was seeing for the first time. Alistair, a changed man, stepped back from his company to be present for every moment. A quiet, powerful love had grown between him and Clara, a bond forged in a shared fight for the little girl who had saved them both. They married in a small ceremony in the garden, with Serafina as the only guest. When she was 21, Serafina held her first solo art exhibition. The gallery was filled with canvases that exploded with color and emotion. The centerpiece was a painting titled First Light. It depicted not a sun or a star, but the silhouette of a woman holding a small light, her face gentle and hopeful. At the end of the night, Serafina stood before the crowd. Her voice, once a timid whisper, was now calm and confident. "People often ask me about the first thing I ever saw," she said, her violet eyes finding Clara in the crowd. "They expect me to talk about the color yellow or the shape of the sun, but the truth is, the first real light I ever saw didn't come from a flashlight. It came from a heart. It came from the woman who refused to believe in the darkness. It came from my mother." She pointed to Clara. The room erupted in applause. Alistair wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders, and together they watched their daughter, no longer a silent girl in a dark room, but an artist who had painted her own future, a future full of brilliant, dazzling light. And that, my friends, is the incredible story of Serafina Sterling. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Your support means the world. What part of this journey hit you the hardest? Let's talk about it in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. We'll see you in the next one.